Welcome to Redefining What's Possible, your guide to assistive technology in Australia. Join us as we explore practical applications of AT, featuring expert interviews and the latest industry insights to enhance your professional development and to improve client outcomes. Welcome to this episode of the Redefining What's Possible podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Uncle. I'm the head of clinical education for ILS, and I trained as an occupational therapist. And today I'm joined again by Tilly Brook. Tilly just did an episode for us on the benefits of power standing wheelchairs. And if you haven't listened to that one yet, I recommend going back and listening to that one first before jumping onto this one and listening to this one. So this one is going to cover how to plan and run a successful trial for power standing wheelchairs. And we are so lucky to have Tilly back to speak with us again today. So in case you haven't met her before, let me give you a little brief introduction to Tilly. So she is an occupational therapist and she's the director of clinical services at Permobil Asia Pacific. She has experience as an OT across Australia, in Singapore and New Zealand, and she has specialised in seating and wheelchairs throughout her career. She's very passionate about the life-changing impact of good prescription, and she now supports therapists like yourself through education and clinical services. So welcome back to the podcast, Tilly.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm really excited to be back. It was such a great chat last time.
Yeah, it was. And you have so much expertise when it comes to power standing wheelchairs. So thank you for coming back and supporting our therapists on planning and running successful trials with this type of AT because it's more complex and we just want it to go well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to kick us off, let's talk about the planning part of a successful trial and what needs to be considered and organised before we even start organising the trial itself.
Really good question because we are seeing some therapists just, they know they need a chair and they call up automatically for a trial. But there's a really important step that needs to happen before then, and that's, our initial assessment or our reassessment if we know the person. Because, that initial assessment is so crucial for collecting all of the clinical information, all of the personal information, and really get to understand the person we're working with, understand who they are, what their goals are, where they want to go, and what their non-negotiables are as well. And when we collect the right information, it allows us to clinically reason and articulate, what are our product parameters? What does the chair need to do? Where does it need to go? And what elements are going to potentially, enable the person we're working with to increase their participation and function and ultimately live their best life? So, this assessment might look a little bit different for each of us because we all have different ways of, going about it. For me, I'm a really, really functional OT. So I'm going to, sit down and maybe, say, yes, I'd love that cup of tea and assess someone functionally. How are they managing with their current piece of AT within their environment? What's working, what's not? And I'll chat it through with them. I saw you struggled here. How could we make it better for you? Or perhaps, if there's some a need to look at someone's cognition, I might be using the PRPP or, whatever is your go-to or is going to work with the individual you're working with, structure or assessment tool to help gather as much information to then really help us establish, that level of function and the goals for that individual. Personally, I'm going to use the ICF model.
Why do you like that? Why do you like the ICF model?
Yeah, I really like it because it's client-centered. It's about the individual, their level of function, their life. It's really not diagnosis-driven. So I think it works particularly well for us here in Australia under the NDIS, rules of funding and that sort of thing too. And I think it enables us.
Yeah, because you talked about last episode how in the US, it's different. It's a medical model. Where here it's quite different in the way that we sort of justify.
Yeah.
if someone needs what they need and why. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think working within any funding model is frustrating. I've had similar issues in Singapore and New Zealand and whatnot. But what is so special about the NDIS is we get to focus on function and participation. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's really special. But that's why we need to collect, and understand the person we're working with really, really well, because they're the expert on themselves. So we really need to develop a great relationship and come together as a team. So, when you're collecting that information, that initial assessment, make sure you're looking at that and understanding that person's life from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed, and how, over the night's really important too. We're looking at all aspects of their home, their local community, school, work. Where are you completing this assessment? Are you meeting them at the local soccer club? Are they spending 3 days a week there, volunteering, or how are they getting to work? So really, seek as much information as possible to be able to paint a really clear picture of the person you're working with.
Yeah, it's good advice. And do you recommend doing a mat eval in there as well as part of
Yeah,
that initial assessment? Yeah.
absolutely.
And would that differ at all from when you're doing mat eval for just a standard wheelchair versus a power standing wheelchair?
No, I think, completing a solid MAT assessment is really important for everyone. We need to understand what's possible in their range of movement and their body, where can they sit and stand functionally, and where perhaps do they need a bit of support as well.
Yeah.
So try not to overthink it, remain, client focused, client centered. And if you're not sure, ask for help. Reach out to your colleague who's an expert. There's plenty of people in the industry who will come along and give you a second pair of hands as well. So if you're not sure what that looks like, ask. There's also some really great free resources online. I initially, these resources are still great today. The ACI network, they have all of the they break down the MAT assessment with some really great learning resources and videos. We've got a whole stack of resources on our website too. So just ask if you're not sure. So yes, a MAT assessment is really, really essential, as well as key measurements.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I think both Permobil and ILS, we're equally to blame on our assessment forms. We have a body with like 20 different measuring points. Yeah. Please don't spend time taking 20 measure points. Measuring body structures. Really, if you can get hip width, leg length, lower leg length, trunk height, chest width, if you can send those key measurements to your wheelchair supplier, I guarantee they will be doing backflips. Measurements for the sake of a trial, those key measurements will really help set up an important trial. A successful trial, I should say. So yes, a MAT assessment is really, really important part of that information gathering, getting those key measurements. And then, not only gathering all this information, but sitting down with the person you're working with and their carers if they need to be there, or their partners. And I always like to ask, what are your top 3 or 4 priorities of this chair? And then I want you to list them out in priorities, because we don't have a unicorn wheelchair yet. I'm sure in 20 years time we will, but it's really easy to get sidetracked by all the bells and whistles and the number of chairs on the market. But if you can prioritize those non-negotiables, it helps you as the clinician, the user, and the wheelchair supplier remain really focused on what's super, super important.
Tilly, I love that advice. Just the top 3. Yeah, I think, and put them in order. And just that focuses everybody. I think that is excellent advice.
Oh, well, hopefully you find it useful, but I think it's so easy to get, oh my gosh, I can do this. But, if your non-negotiables are non-negotiables, we don't want to lose focus of those things along the way. What we're going to do after that assessment, I'm still not going to call up my wheelchair supplier yet. I'm going to really think about, well, here are my goals, okay? And this is what I need out of the chair and the seating to enable that person to achieve them. So, for example, it could be I have a non-negotiable of a really small turning circle. I've only got, this many centimeters to turn in. So then that non-negotiable is going to be, you go to the wheelchair supplier and say, I need a chair that can do this. And that's really easy to help narrow it down.
Mm-hmm.
Or, your goals might be that Mr. Brown has a goal of being able to, plant seedlings in his raised garden bed. So then, I need a chair that's going to go into an active reach position. Let's have a chair that let's trial elevate and active reach to do that, or query stand. I need a cushion that's going to, Mr. Brown also has reducible posterior pelvic tilt. So I need a cushion which has an ischial shelf. I might need to consider a pelvic belt, and then posteriorly I need to block the PSIS at the backrest. So, there's lots of things to consider, but if you write down, the goal or the problem, then we can write down the element of the equipment or the product parameter that's going to help overcome those barriers or achieve those goals. And by sharing that with the wheelchair supplier as well, it helps them understand and for you all to come together as a team to ultimately achieve the goals. So,
and for, from our perspective, from someone like who works for ILS, just to bring the right equipment out for the trials. Yeah.
Because we can't bring 5 chairs.
Yeah.
And I mean that
all fit in the van.
So logistically, but also you think of for the user to bring out 5 chairs, how overwhelming is that going to be?
Yeah.
So if we can get the trial down to 2 chairs, maybe it is, a front and a mid, because we're not quite sure which one will fit in or which one the user will prefer. Or maybe it's, try and get it down to 2 cushions and 2 backrests. So by taking the time to do the clinical reasoning, work through those product parameters, it's really going to end up with a better trial. Mm-hmm. And also it means you've got so much more evidence to assist in your report writing at the end.
Yeah.
You've got your hypothesis essentially, which then you're going to take through to the trial and then to your report writing as well.
And my next question for you was around structuring the trial for success. And this kind of leads into that, because all that assessment is going to then help you then have a plan for the actual trial itself.
Absolutely.
So can you give any more tips around structuring the actual trial?
Yeah. So my first tip is to remain absolutely user-focused. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think particularly in, when we're talking about power standing trials, if the individual we're working with is quite anxious, then for me, the initial goal is going to be, let's focus on the stand first and really enable that individual to feel supported and set up and confident in getting into that stand. Mm-hmm. Okay, so, if there is anxiety and worry about the stand, focus on the sit to stand or the supine to stand and just do it slowly.
Is it quite common to have people feeling quite anxious coming up into a stand when they haven't stood for a long time?
Yeah. If they haven't stood in a long time, it can absolutely be a little bit scary and a little bit overwhelming. But I think that's quite normal. You know, if you're doing something new for the first time, I'm sure, you get butterflies. I know I do.
Yeah.
So, be aware of any kind of slow points we might need to have, but make sure you really communicate that with your wheelchair supplier.
Yeah.
Okay. Because then they're only going to come in with 1 chair. They're going to come in a lot slower maybe, or, we're going to work that through together. So be really mindful if we need to take that into consideration. Mm-hmm. But, from there, really think about the trial. So, most wheelchair reps will come out anywhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours. Okay.
It's a long time.
it's a long time, but it's not.
Yeah,
At the
good.
same time, if we're doing
Yeah.
hoist transfers and all of those things. So my first advice to you is get there early and make sure that, the user and the carer are set up, ready to go. Have they had their meds? Where does their bowel regime fit into it? Do we need to schedule the trial in and around those sort of things? So,
Yeah, that's a good thing.
be,
You need to think about those things for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then, be ready to rock and roll essentially. And then, when we get the person into the chair, you as a therapist need to be really clear about, well, what evidence am I gathering today? Okay, so what do I need to first of all, make sure this is going to work for the person.
Yeah.
And then if we think it's going to work, how are we going to gather that information? So for me, I think about 3 or 4 functional tasks that we need to do. So we need to make sure we're justifying stand and each of the power seat functions in addition to the base of the chair.
Mm-hmm.
So I break it down in that way. So from a power seat function perspective, particularly standing, let's use cooking a simple meal in the kitchen, perhaps. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have permission to take a couple of photos along the way, but I'm going to have my user, first of all, try and complete the task in their normal seated position in the chair. I'm going to say, Mr. Brown can complete 10% of the task, 20% with this much assistance, and, the rest he's unable to complete without maximal assistance. And then from there, I'm going to get him to go into Elevate and say, hey, Mr. Brown, complete the same task in Elevate. And I'm going to, observe and then report, how independent is he, or maybe he's fatiguing quite quickly in that position. And then I'm going to keep, stepping up. Then I'm going to go into active reach. So maybe 35 degrees of active reach, which is kind of like a half stand. So similar to what's behind me. So, Mr. Brown in active reach is able to complete, maybe 70% of the task, or is reporting of fatigue, or, whatever. And then I'm going to get him to go into a full stand and complete the task. So, we're really able to demonstrate that reasonable and necessary, that impact of function and participation as well.
Yeah.
We
And
might,
ruling out what doesn't work too.
yeah,
At the same
yeah.
time. Yeah.
We have had times though where active reach is actually enough to increase
Yeah.
function and participation, that, we've gone through this process and we haven't actually needed to prescribe stand. We've actually been able to prescribe, more of a reasonable power seat function from a cost perspective, because someone's been able to do everything that they've wanted to do. So,
Which is it's a great outcome.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's what clinical reasoning is, right? So, I go through this, this way of assessing the 3 or 4 key tasks, functional tasks or goals for the individual. Because, as maths teachers say, show you're working out.
Yeah.
How did you get to stand? That the funding body wants to know, okay, well, are you prescribing stand just because it's nice to have, or is it actually the power seat function that is going to enable this individual to participate and do what they want to do?
Tilly, that's such good advice. Really clear. And I've actually seen that Permobil has a form that you
Yep.
can actually follow these steps that you're talking about to show you're working out, like you just explained. And do you want to let everyone know where they can get hold of that? Because I think that's a really useful tool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So I think we call it the power standing trial form, I think.
Yeah.
And you can access it on the clinical services drop down menu on the Permobil Australia website. So you'll click on that and then just scroll down, and there's a whole lot of power standing resources. And that's free to download. Download it, use it. At the top, we have, what's the goal? And then we prompt you, current AT. We start at Elevate, then we do active reach, and then we do stand. Because I think at a trial, things can move so quickly it's really nice as the clinician to have that prompt to be like, yes, I've done Elevate. Oh, I forgot to do active reach. Let's go back and do active reach for, working on the car, or, in the workplace or at church or whatever that might be. Because, it's so easy to miss things. A trial happens and moves so quickly. So, think about those 3 or 4 tasks, and be prepared as much as you can. Have the toothbrush ready to go. If we're going out into the community, what shop are we going into, or, what supermarket are we going into? Really, really pre-plan that as much as you can, because it's going to mean a much more smoother trial. And also you're going to be able to see functionally the impact, that power seat function is having for that individual.
Yeah. I know we said before, 2 hours sounds like a long time. It's not when you're doing all of that. You need to be really well planned. You're right.
Absolutely. And, it is really important that we're justifying each power seat function. So even if we are prescribing a power standing chair, we need to justify tilt, recline, VS legs, elevate, active reach, and then stand as well. So, we've got so much evidence that we need to, not just evidence, we need to assess first and foremost, and then collect the right evidence to be able to use.
When you say collect evidence, are you talking about photos?
Yeah, a couple. I don't think we need thousands of photos in our report, but sometimes a photo saves 1,000 words.
Yeah.
And, in our report writing, we do need to be quite succinct, to say, just break task analysis. That's, go back to uni days. And it's something I think as OTs we just do automatically anyway.
Yeah, we get trained that way, don't we?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. But we just need to be able to break down that task to show, where the difficulty is and how the piece of AT is overcoming that barrier.
Yeah, it's good. So in all your time working as an OT, have you ever been on a power standing wheelchair trial that did not go well, did not go to plan? And what did you learn from that? And what could we learn from that sort of experience too?
Look, it's not one of mine, but it is a recent story I have heard. Not a story. A therapist called me up for some help, actually. She's like, oh, the trial was really successful, but I don't have anything really to show for it. Like, what have I missed here? So she called me with I know it's right, but I've missed something. Help me out. And we were talking about the trial, and she was talking through how beautiful it was, how the end user had stood and hugged and kissed his wife in standing for the first time in 15 years, and how beautiful it was. And I could tell, I was even getting emotional listening to this therapist. And I said, it's beautiful. And I said, okay, well, that's fantastic. What else did you do on the trial? I said, oh, well, we drove around a little bit, and you could almost see her going, oh, I know what I've missed.
Yeah.
So, everybody, even the supplier, kind of said, yeah, it was just so beautiful that we all we missed the big picture.
Yeah.
We all got caught up in the emotion on the day and how special it was, and how life-changing that moment was and how important that was. And I don't think anybody really wanted to bring them back to the real world. So, in the end, they actually ended up hiring a chair for a couple of weeks for an extended trial for this individual. And over that couple of weeks, the therapist worked really closely with the end user and broke down, what are the goals of standing, and how are we going to collect and justify power standing for you, to just really focus on the big picture side of things. So, that wasn't a bad trial at all, but it was just one where everyone focused on how beautiful is that, right?
That is so beautiful.
Yeah. So there was no blame, and everyone just kind of went, but it is really important that as the clinician, we're focusing on, the clinical process, assessing, making sure this piece of AT is the right piece of AT, why it is, and then collecting that evidence to for the, clinical justification side of things. And, I know I've been talking a lot about the power seat functions. Don't forget about the base. We still need to, clinically reason and assess, is this a front wheel drive or is this a mid wheel drive? And why? Why do we need this? And we also still need to justify, for standing, why power standing chair? Why not a manual chair or a power standing chair and a tilt table?
Yeah.
So, there's a number of elements we really need to consider in this process. And I think, from a funder's perspective, it's a fair question.
Yeah, because these are expensive pieces of
Yeah.
AT. Yeah.
They are. So I don't disagree as to, being questioned about it. But it's really important that we go through the clinical reasoning process, assess, come together as a multidisciplinary team. The physio might be able to provide a number of reasons as to why a power standing chair would be better over a tilt table. If I can have one less piece of equipment in my house, I would be ecstatic as well. If I don't need a tilt table, happy days.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, lots and lots to consider. So really go in with a plan. And if your trial doesn't go right, it's okay. If something happens and it goes, left field, just have a chat with the supplier, have a chat with the user. You guys are a team. There's evidence that shows when the user, OT and supplier and manufacturer even more so, come together and work as a team, you get really, really great outcomes.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and the fact that there's evidence there to support it as well.
Yeah.
So pause, communicate, reflect. If you need to organise another trial, organise another trial. If you need to look at hiring a chair for a couple of weeks too, look at that option too. So yeah, there's lots we need to look at, but the more prepared you are, the better the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really good advice. Okay, let's talk about report writing.
Mm-hmm.
So you've had an amazing assessment, you've planned the trial, let's just say it's gone really smoothly. Yep. And now you're up to the point where you're writing the report. What tips have you got?
Take one step at a time. Absolutely. So look, the number one piece of advice is do that really good initial assessment first.
Yeah.
And document along the way. On this next piece of advice, I'm going to say do as I say, not as I do. And often that, specifically if we're looking at NDIS reports, that first part of the report, part one, that can pretty well be written, before your assessment as well. So I think that can help with that clinical reasoning process. Have you collected all of the information you need? Have you got a really good hypothesis? What are your goals? So, make sure you've done that really, really good assessment, because that really does help the process. So really good initial assessment. You've planned your trials, okay, and you've collected as much information as you can along the way. And then when you're writing the report, be clear. Try not to waffle, okay, because I imagine that people reading our reports have a lot of reports to get to. And I think about, I did debating at high school. I'll throw it out there. I did debating. I'm not sure if you did, Sarah.
I think we all had to do it in primary school. I didn't do it in high school, but definitely did it in primary school.
I voluntarily put myself forward for high school. And in a way, I personally, you might be listening to this going, oh my gosh, Tilly, seriously, what are you on? But I think about AT reports as a bit of a debate. Part one, introductory speaker. This is Mr. Brown. This is who he is as a person. This is his family life. This is where he lives. This is what he does. And these are his goals, and these are the current barriers he's having, whether it's with his current AT or perhaps we're prescribing a wheelchair for the first time. Then the second part is, we're adding to that argument, that debating argument. We're looking at Mr. Brown's level of functioning, perhaps where his difficulties are. We might be talking through some standardized outcome measures as well. We're really painting that picture. And at this point, we're really starting to think about and throw out there, well, this particular wheelchair could help to overcome these barriers or enable Mr. Brown to achieve his goals and increase his function and participation. Because by the time we get to part 3, this is the section where we're talking about the chair. Okay, so we're going to be breaking down each element of the chair and really demonstrating why not only the chair, but each element of the chair is reasonable and necessary and going to enable Mr. Brown to achieve his goals. Mm-hmm. So, if we're talking about the power seat functions, I'm going to break down tilt, functionally. Why is tilt going to help Mr. Brown? When is he going to use it? Then I'm going to be adding recline and legs, talking through all those functional elements. And then from there, I'm going to talk through what we're going to use elevate for. And if elevate is all we need, fantastic. But if it's not, talk through where elevate's going to work and then where it's still not working. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then we're going to build up to there from active reach. Okay. How is active reach going to enable Mr. Brown to increase his function, if it is participation, or if it's not? And then stand. What is the standing feature going to do that all the other power seat functions can't do? Mm-hmm. Okay. Why is it reasonable and necessary? And, let's show the report reviewer how Mr. Brown is going to increase his participation and function. Mm-hmm. And potentially, is it also going to reduce carer burden, informal care or even formal care? So
do you have to be careful around that one though, when you potentially, if they're worried about their care hours?
Yeah. So, and that's a discussion we all have to have as a team as well. If this element of AT is going to reduce formal care, does everybody want it? Does the user want that? Do their carers want that? Or what is most reasonable and necessary from the funder's perspective as well? So there's lots we need to take into consideration and really make sure you're working as a team and ultimately coming back to those goals and working within the rules and regulations of the funding body as well.
What I love about the advice you just gave is that structure and that showing you're working out. Like it is like a debate. I like that analogy. It works for this. But that structure, and then the person kind of goes along the journey with you, and it follows how you structured the trial. So it all flows together.
Yeah.
Which is why the planning right at the beginning is so important all the way through.
Absolutely. And when therapists and I talk around, this is where I'm having a difficulty, when we're talking through the process and go, I missed that. In that discussion, it can be, I knew I missed something. So it's okay. If you've missed something, we can go back. You can have another trial if you need it. But, we only have so many hours to work in as well, which is, may or may not be best practice. But if we can work with the hours that are in the plan, planning, problem solving, and collecting the right information at the time of trial sets us up, for a solid report.
So what advice do you give if the report does get knocked back? What's your advice then?
Take a breath. It's okay. Mm-hmm. It's, it happens. Try not to take it personally. I think, I think we all put in so many hours that it is heartbreaking when we get a report knocked back. Hours and hours have gone into that. But I would say actually take one step before you submit your report, get someone to review it as well.
Yeah, that's good advice.
I know that I read what I want to read. If I've been writing something for a really, really long time, I hand it over to someone and say, can you take a red pen to this for me, please? So, give it give it to someone in your team, keep it confidential. You can give it to them de-identified, and have a colleague lovingly tear it apart. And I mean that in the nicest possible way, because they'll be able to find gaps. So before you do submit it, do get feedback from someone as well. But if you are knocked back, it's okay. Okay. It's disappointing, but we can go back with more evidence. If they've asked a couple of key questions, provide that evidence if you're really confident. And if you're not, phone a friend. Talk to your mentor, talk to your supervisor, talk to your colleague, talk to the rep who was on site, or, reach out to the manufacturer and say, what have I missed here? Is there, what other evidence can I provide? Or ask the question, did I overprescribe? Is this a fair question that is being asked by the funding body? What have I missed? Have I overprescribed? And often we don't, but I think sometimes asking the question is a nice double check.
Yeah, definitely.
But use the community around you. Work with the user, okay, to collect any additional evidence you might need, and go back to the funding body in a really succinct way. Okay. Again, have a supervisor or a mentor, or even one of us, if we're available, will happily give you the support you need if we can do that. And there's support within this community of AT providers. All of the suppliers and manufacturers, we want ultimately the best outcome for each user. And I mean that. It's just not a throwaway line. So, it's such a great community that wants really good outcomes. So you're not alone. Reach out to Sarah as well. There's so many of us in the industry who are always happy to help.
And I think that comes out every time I do a podcast episode. That's what comes out. We're all in it for the same reason. We all want great outcomes for the person at the end of the day who's going to be using the AT.
Yep. And I think we're all wheelchair nerds. And I say that in a really I say it in a really positive way.
Yeah.
My friend and colleague in the US, she hosts Wheelchair Nerds. And every time I listen to that podcast, it makes me smile, because it's a whole group of like-minded people who just want really great outcomes for every single user. It doesn't matter what product they're in. Everyone wants great outcomes. So don't hesitate.
We're a big team, right? We're a big team. It's
Absolutely.
Good. I like that. I like that. Really, such great advice, Tilly. Okay, so we've talked a lot, and we brought out a lot of really important points from this conversation. Top three points for running successful trials. What would they be?
Be prepared and complete a really great initial assessment.
Okay, definitely.
Be clear and organized on your trial. Okay, so, for you and the user together to be like, right, this is what we're doing, let's be prepared for those 2 hours and get as much, let's do the assessment, make sure it's right, and then gather the evidence. And ask for help. Ask questions. If you don't know the product, speak to your rep and say, who can I find out more about this product? If you're on the road and you don't have time, can you connect me with the manufacturer? I need to understand what is special about this product and why I'm scripting this over a different chair. We do need to potentially trial other chairs, but sometimes we can consider them. If you can, outline why, perhaps this chair over my shoulder over, a non-standing chair or a different chair, manufacturer's chair, understanding the features of each chair is really important to help within that clinical reasoning process, because they are, they're not cheap pieces of AT. And even if we are prescribing a low-cost piece of AT, we still need to make sure it's the best piece of equipment for that individual.
And it's okay to not know everything.
Yeah.
You can't actually. As an OT, you can't know everything.
No. And I learn something every day still about wheelchairs and seating. And I've been doing this for a while. So I love learning every day. So, ask a question. There's no silly question out there. And there's plenty of people who will happily sit down and chat away with you while you're driving home from an appointment or, wherever you may be.
Yeah. Very valuable advice. Thank you. Okay, we're to our final closing question. So I asked you this on the last episode, so I'm going to ask you to think of a different example this time. So can you describe a moment when assistive technology significantly changed a client's life, and how has this impacted you?
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I was asked to come in just to provide a different perspective on an assessment. My local sales rep had called and said, look, when you're in town, I'd love you to come out, and the therapist would really value your thoughts as well. So they had a youngish gentleman, probably in his mid-30s, who he'd had a spinal cord injury and had intense pain, like life-altering pain, and really limited his participation, and was spending, 90% of his time in bed, to the point that he'd developed significant contractures in the hips and knees and feet. The rep had said to me, look, because of his pain, he really doesn't want to engage with too many people, but is open to, he knows he needs a wheelchair to get out of the house. And it was, the therapist was really great, younger therapist, but understood, I need some support in this case. So we went out, and this person they were in their bed, and he provided consent. He said, look, I'm in a lot of pain, so I just want this done as fast as possible. So, I explained to him, I said, look, we need to do a quick MAT eval. I did not do a full MAT evaluation. I knew clinically it was not appropriate. And I explained to him that ideally I'd like to get him in a seated position to see if he could sit on the edge of his bed, and a couple of key measurements. And I just wanted to understand how his body moved or didn't move. And he said really clearly, I can, if you're fast, I can do this. And he spoke with his carer, and he said, look, I'm going to do some pain management. So we stepped out for about 20 minutes, and we left him with his wonderful carer, and they managed that. And, I was trying to just build a bit of rapport. And he said, I know what you're doing, but I don't need you to do that today. I just need you to do this. I said, absolutely, cool. Got it. Get in and out. So we did a really brief MAT assessment. I was able to, also review, was able to have a conversation. I wasn't worried about driving a pouch or anything like that. And it was just a real quick teamwork. We got in, we took some measurements, and then he, that trust was built really quickly because
you listened to him.
Yeah.
You listened to him.
Yeah. He's like, this is what I'm happy to do. The other therapist had lots of that other information about where he was going in the community and that sort of thing. But we needed to make sure we could set up a chair successfully for the trial, getting those basic measurements, because he was in so much pain. It was essential that it was going to fit him like a glove first time. Because, he said, if this doesn't work, I'm not doing it again.
Wow. No pressure.
Yeah, right. But I must say, what made it a success was the therapist reaching out for help. The local sales rep actually reached out to the Permobil rep. And I think because the Permobil rep and myself were so far removed, and this is just the one job we're doing, we built the trust. We were really clear about what we were doing and weren't doing and what we were there for. He engaged, and was not engaged is the wrong word, but, we came together as a team. We listened to him. We were really user focused. Everything was only ever done with consent and engagement. And, next time he came back, we set up the chair beautifully. The local rep had those measurements, perfect. And we were able to get him out of bed.
So good.
He took that trial chair outside into the sun for the first time in so long.
Yeah, so good.
So, for me, it's not always perfect, but it was a really, really good reminder about being really, really user focused, listening to them, and they're an expert on themselves, right?
Yeah,
You
and
know,
he knew what he could stand. He knew how much he didn't have a
yep,
lot of time that he could actually engage
yep,
with people in his bedroom,
yep,
moving his body around and the pain he was
yeah,
in. He knew he didn't have very long. He couldn't give you a
yep,
lot of time.
yep.
Yeah.
So, that sometimes it's really nice to just, you know, be reminded that
Yeah.
everybody is an individual, and no matter what, the barriers are or how tricky it might be, if we remain user focused and work as a team, we can get really, really great outcomes. And that therapist wrote a splendid report. They did such a great job, and it was approved first time as well.
Wonderful.
So it was really, really great. Teamwork.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Teamwork and client focused. Love
Yep.
it.
And the user is an expert on themselves.
Yeah.
I can't say that enough.
Yeah. Well, Tilly, you are a wealth of knowledge and
Oh,
expertise, and you make things so clear and you break things down in a way my brain really likes. So I'm
well,
sure
good.
that everyone listening to this has enjoyed it too. So thank you for your support and your help when it comes to running successful trials and report writing as well. It's been really valuable. Thank you for your time.
Well, you're welcome. And look, if you've got a question, ask, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Where everybody is here to absolutely support you. And I'm going to plug my team. We have such a wealth of knowledge in the Permobil Clinical Services team. So please reach out to them and myself. We're always happy to support and have a wheelchair nerd chat any day of the week.
Yeah, make everybody happy. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.